So countries deal with this in all kinds of ways. More questions? Yeah. Does Germany allow dual citizenship? For a while they did not. I'm not sure they do now. They do, okay. They do. It was interesting about Germany. I speak German and I've lived in Germany for a long time. And, for years actually. And the last time I was there for a year, I was a visiting professor at the University of Munich. And there was actually a chance, they kind of wanted me to stay. And a bunch of people kind of made this little kind of movement to get Kotsky to stay. And I like Munich a lot. Munich is really beautiful, it's an easy place to live, and it was fun. But I do have to say, that's totally independent of the Jewish thing, which I know is hard. Totally independent of that. I could never see myself as becoming German. Like, what would that mean for me to be a German? I didn't know what that meant. It wasn't the same as becoming an American. Becoming an American simply said, I share these sets of ideals. I share these sets of ideals. I live here. You can't tell me apart from anybody else. In Germany, becoming a German, what does it mean to say, I've become a German? That's not a juridical statement. That's not simply a statement of law that I carry this passport now. When you say I've become a German, you're saying something else. And that was one of the reasons I didn't stay. Almost others. It's one of the reasons I didn't stay. Okay. Shall I push on? You want to talk? You want a question? Yeah. Loud. That nationalism comes out of what? Comes out of what? Nationalism comes out of major wars, yes. But who's fighting those wars? Are nations fighting those wars? Who's fighting them? Are they fighting them as groups? It's that sense of groupness that you and I share something. That somehow, when poor ducks off the coast of BC wash up with oil on their little wings, that I feel bad for those Canadian ducks. That I don't know any of the people in BC. I've only been there once in my life. That somehow my fate is tied to theirs. This we feeling. That's new. And that even if people fought with each other, there was not necessarily a we feeling. I mean, there's that very funny, there was a, I don't know if any of you ever listened to National Public Radio, I don't know why you would, but anyway, it's like the American CBC, and there was this program on a couple of years back about national anthems. And where did national anthems come from? And they talked about "O Canada," and they talked about the Star Spangled Banner, and they talked about Deutschland über alles, and all the different, national anthems and how they change over time. And the whole Russian thing is totally screwed up because they had this national anthem that was under the Soviets, which had all these words about party of Lenin, party of Stalin. Then they got rid of the words, obviously, because they got rid of communism. But they liked the music, so they kept the music without any words. That happened in Germany too. They keep on changing the stanzas, right? Because they can't keep on saying like, our borders are over there in Poland and stuff like that. And then they asked Mel Brooks, who's very funny, who had this running series of skits called, I wish I should have played the YouTube version of it, right? He played, what was it, the 10,000-year-old man? And they would ask him, he was being interviewed. And it was very funny because he was a 10,000-year-old man speaking with a Yiddish accent. Right? And so they said, so, 10,000 years ago, did you have national anthems? He said, absolutely. How did it go? How did it go? He said, it went like this. Everyone can go to hell except Cave 7. Right? It seems to think about that, this whole notion of cave. It's sweet, read Cave 7, we're good. Everyone else is bad. Right? We're better than those. right? We have our culture to protect. You see how ridiculous it sounds to us now. Of course, 10,000 years ago in the caves, there was no nationalism. But when you say nationalism, what you mean is this we feeling that you have with people who you have never met in your life and you will probably never meet. It's not a family, but it is like a family. You feel closer to those people in British Columbia than you do to those people on the other side of Niagara Falls in Buffalo, New York. That's weird. That's really weird. They're closer. You'll probably have much more contact with them in your lives than you ever will with anybody in British Columbia. But yet you feel this sense of we. And the question is, why do you feel it? Why do you feel it? Because there's undoubtedly that you do. I know how Canadian you are. I've experienced the wrath of insulting Canadian nationalism many times on teaching evaluations to get professors for years. I know how Canadian you are, and I'm not trying to write it down. That's good. It doesn't make you any different from anybody else in the world who feels really strongly about being French or Ghanaian or whatever. Let's push on. Okay, so I would argue that nationalism comes out of the process of modernization. It doesn't exist before modernization. Why? Well, Europe historically, where nationalism first started, by the way, it consisted of high cultures and low cultures. Monarchs at the top, and their priests who shared a common culture. And then you had what everybody spoke out there in the countryside, in the rural areas. You had this huge proliferation of vernacular cultures, while people spoke to each other. There might be, and what I mean, that difference between high culture and low culture, anybody who knows German knows exactly what I mean. The difference between high German, you think you know German. Then you go to the countryside of Bavaria with no clue what they're saying to each other. But that's not true of just German, of course. That's true of Arabic as well. There is what they kind of high-cultured standard Arabic at the top. There's actually no one standardized Arabic. There are a few standardized Arabics. But let's say, the Cairo Arabic, which is considered kind of like the Paris of the Arab world. And then there's what everybody else speaks out there. And it's different. It's just different. What exists in Arabic, that existed in French. Standardized French didn't really exist before the 19th century. You had people out in what was northern France today who couldn't speak a word of French. What happens however, is that over time, as industrialization begins to occur, there is a need for the creation of a common culture. People have to be able to communicate with each other. Non-context-bound communication. What do I mean by that? Non-context-bound. You see, if you're dealing with somebody on a face-to-face basis, you don't actually even have to know much language in common. A few grunts and groans will do. Or a few common words. Anybody who's ever traveled knows, right? You travel, you have your little phrase book, right? And you get out there, you go into the market, and you start haggling. And all you need to know is a few numbers, pleases and thank yous. You're off to the races. It's context bound. But what about when you can no longer see the person anymore? When you have to coordinate? They can't see your face, your eyes, your anything. You have to be able to communicate in a non-context-bound way. And the only way to do that is to share a common language. You have to share a common language. And to share a common language, how do you get people to speak the same language? It's not so simple. It's not so simple. Schooling, literacy, the creation of a national literature, poetry. The standardization of languages occurs at the same time as industrialization. Eggheads like me run around the countryside taking all the different vernaculars that everybody spoke among all those peasants in what is today the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Hungary. And we gathered all the words together and we said, here is your dictionary. Here is your grammar. This is what we're going to teach in school, and you must by law send your children to school. In doing that, here I'm going to say something very politically incorrect, we destroy cultures. We destroy all that little local variation, don't we? By creating a common culture, two groups of people that might have thought under other circumstances they spoke a separate language. In fact, professors might have convinced them, you are an X, you are a Y. X's are good, Y's are bad. X's are clean, Y's are dirty. X's work hard, Y's are lazy. X's are in good shape, Y's are not in good shape, whatever. You know, all the prejudices that are out there. And you create two sets, and then all of a sudden you say, and here's your language. It sounds a lot like the Y language, but it's related. It's not the same language, it's a different language. Instead what happens is some professor comes along and says, no, you're actually the same language. You speak the same language. It's just a little bit different. And your children will all speak exactly the same language. Standardized XY. Check this slow down. Yeah. But who takes? Who does the taking? It's not just an organic process that happens. This is something that's constructed by states at a given point in time. I mean, the idea of what goes in the dictionary as a word. What counts as a word? That's a decision. Somebody has to make that decision. And in most countries, those decisions are made by boards appointed by governments. You can say whatever you want out there. You guys can use the word random. Here's a word, random. I know my older son uses this all the time, random. Random means what?
Random.
How do you use it on the street here in Toronto? Weird, strange. You know, of course, that that's not the meaning of the word. It's unsystematic. It's the opposite of systematic. If something's on a random, it's systematic. And it took me the longest time to figure out. Right? And I said, I came home with all these random people on the street. I said, well, what'd you see? Were they systematic people on the street? But those decisions about what a word, now what you're doing when you use the word random in the way of being strange, you're challenging. You're actually making a political statement, you don't realize it. You're challenging the state definition of the word, the official definition of the word in the Oxford English Dictionary. If you use it long enough that way, eventually you'll win. You'll win. But for the most part, I'm not a fluent French speaker, for example, how do you say weekend in French? Fin de semaine, right? Not fluent, I know a little bit. Fin de semaine. How do they say that? How do they say it in France? Anybody from France? They say weekend. Where do they say fin de semaine? In Montreal. Why? Because they're worried. They don't want everybody saying weekend. It's rampant Englishisms. Random Englishisms. Right? Those are political decisions. Those are important political decisions. Those aren't things that just happen randomly in an unsystematic way. Yeah. the vernacular. The vernacular is the language that actually, the unstandardized language that actually people speak. Creole could become a high culture, but you have to create a Creole dictionary, and Creole grammar, and Creole literature, and of course there is. Haiti, there is. Yeah, it did become a high culture, right? When the president of Haiti gets up and makes a speech, and he wants everybody to understand it, he doesn't get up and speak like he's from Paris. He'd be laughed out of the room. In Quebec, he'd be laughed out of the room for that matter, too. No, I mean, you can take any language you want and try to make a project of standardizing it. And the history of languages, the history of cultures, is the history of failed projects. The ones you see out there are the winners. Most of the projects are losers. I'm going to give you one from my own culture. Yiddish. It existed. It exists still today. There's remnants of it. It's taught here at U of T. 3 levels of it, by the way, if you're interested in taking it. My grandparents spoke it. There's a literature in it. There were even Yiddish language schools in certain places where governments granted that. Right, they weren't government funded, they were private funded. There was even a project to say we should have a Jewish state based on Yiddish, not Hebrew. Yiddish comes historically before modern Hebrew. Interesting. We should make a state based on that. And that state should be wherever, Poland or wherever, based on it. Have you ever read Michael Chavin's book, The Yiddish Policeman's Union? Right, which is about this hypothetical, it's like Israel doesn't exist, that they created a Jewish state in Alaska based on Yiddish. But as a project to create an independent state, it was a failure. It failed. And there was no backing for it. There was no state backing for it. And because of that, it's dying. If not in my lifetime, perhaps in your lifetime, it might be dead. It's not totally dead yet because there are some very religious Jews who speak it to each other. And so it's being revived that way. But it's kind of hanging on by its fingernails at this point. The language that actually worked was Hebrew. Why? That's no accident. They got themselves a state. They got themselves a state and made sure everybody goes to school and learns modern Hebrew. And it's an absolutely fascinating thing. They took a language that nobody had spoken in 2,000 years as a vernacular. They modernized it and then taught it to everybody in schools. And it kind of worked as a project. You have 6 million Jews in Israel now speaking Hebrew to each other as their native language. That's what they speak. Literature, poetry, people dream and fall in love and do all that stuff in Hebrew. This need to create a standardized high culture, to make the high culture and low culture coincide, that only happens in industrial society. When there's a need for non-context-bound coordination, non-context-bound communication, so we all speak the same language. You could write me, never having met me,